Hello and welcome to CC Imaging's Introduction to Adobe Photoshop. In this video we're going to look at your preferences. Now, depending on the speed of your machine, changing the preferences can either help speed up or can slow down Adobe Photoshop. So they are very important. To find your preferences, we will go to the Edit menu, down to Preferences and click on General. So you can see there are lots of options here. Now, we won't be going into detail on every single option, but I will show you a few of the tips that I would use to set up my preferences to make sure I have as much control as possible over Photoshop, and also I'm trying to get the best performance out of it for my particular machine. A few of these may look different to what you have selected, and we will go through them. So the color picker is whether you get swatches or the Adobe Hue color picker, which is kind of like a huge palette of colors which all mixed together. So I generally want to keep that as Adobe. Auto updates open documents. Now, if you imagine two people working on separate machines open the same image, every time one of them saves the image after making an edit, the other person's machine will automatically be updated with all of the edits person number one has done. So it can be a time-saving exercise if you have a very strict deadline and you need two editors to work on a single image, but generally we can leave that turned off because sometimes we want to go back to a pre-saved version. So we don't want it saving all the time generally. Beeping when done. If we're running a complicated filter, then the machine will make a noise when Photoshop has finished that particular filter. Again, it's not something that I tend to do, with it being a working environment. You can probably hear the chattering in the background and the machines. We don't really need added noises, and it can be a bit of a distraction. We'll skip down a few to export clipboard. Now, when you copy or paste something in Windows or Mac, it goes to something called a clipboard, which is a bit like a background process. If you imagine when you want to copy something, you're handing it to somebody stood at the side of you, and then when you want to paste it, this person then hands the thing back to you. Export clipboard allows you to copy something in Photoshop, the image that you have open, and then maybe paste it directly into an email or into something like Word or a different application. Now let's skip down a few again. So resize image during place. This means if you have a very large image and you want to add it to a very small image, it will shrink down to constrain to the sides of your small image. Now, I like to keep this turned off because, for example, if I have a very close-up shot of somebody's face and I want to add it to a group of people, I want the most resolution out of the image that I'm pasting, so I don't want it to automatically shrink. I want control of that shrinking, so I will leave this unticked. Animated zoom, I'm not a particular fan because I do like this staged zoom that Photoshop has traditionally used. Zoom resizes windows. Now, for me this is very useful because as I zoom in, it actually grows my window. I'll show you more about this in a future video, but it's something that I like. You may dislike it. So again, these really are just for taste, really. Zoom with the scroll wheel, as you can see, I'm not using a scroll wheel, so that's turned off. Zoom click to point to center, again, I don't use this. Flick panning, I don't like not knowing where the image stops, so I don't like to use flick panning. Place or drag raster images as smart objects. When you copy one image and paste it onto another image in Photoshop, this will make the image you have pasted a smart object. And what it does really is it minimizes any type of compression that might be applied when you start messing around with that image. But generally I find it to be an extra step that gets in the way sometimes if I'm working on a tight deadline, so I leave this turned off. Those are the four that I'd have ticked for general. If we move on to the next, we have the interface. This controls really the colour of Photoshop's background, so this grey area and the colour of the bars. We want to show menu colours and show tooltips so that when we hover over something we get a tooltip. And here auto show hidden panels, so when you move over something it will show. The other two, open documents as tabs, enable floating document window docking. Now I'm not a particular fan of these because I like to be able to move my images around if I'm copying from one image to another, and having tabs can sometimes get in the way of that. I'm not a fan of the tabs there, so those are the three that I'd use from that particular screen. Now file handling, this really asks us where we're going to save our document. If you open a document in folder number 1, when you press save as, it will want to save it to wherever the original file was opened from. So this is very useful if you are opening an image as part of an organized workflow and you want to save it back to the location of your original. These other ones ask before saving a layered TIFF. Really it depends on whether it's something for print output or not. Generally I'd save layered files as a PSD format, but it's okay to leave that on as well, just in case you're giving it to an art house who can't open that or require strict instructions on a TIFF format. PSD, PSB. PSB really is, it's kind of a Photoshop PSD file which contains more pixels than the largest size that a PSD is allowed to be. Only Photoshop can open the PSB files, and again, depending on the speed of your machine, saving something that's that huge may really make your system crawl. So we'll go to the next one, performance here. Now here's where things get a bit more interesting for your PC. I do run lots of different software, so I don't let Photoshop use too much. Some people put it all the way up here. I wouldn't recommend too much because Windows will then start arguing with Photoshop for spare RAM. So I would put it down somewhere around here, which is good enough for me. And I do large prints, A1, A0, and it copes reasonably well. Something else we have is the scratch disk. Now when we run out of available memory, Photoshop will use space on the hard drive as memory. It's worth having something called a scratch disk, which could be a partitioned area on your disk, or it could be an additional disk like an SSD drive, which are very good. Arguably you don't really want Photoshop to use the hard drive where you're storing your images, because as Photoshop is using the RAM, it's also spinning the plat around to write and read information from the file. So I really want to keep the two separate if possible. Having a dedicated scratch disk is always beneficial when using Photoshop. Now the history and cache. History states, this dictates how many times we can make a mark and then decide to undo the mark we've just made. The more history states we have, the slower the computer can be, because every time you make a history state, or you make a mark or an edit, Photoshop will take a snapshot or a recording of the whole image there. This can quickly, again, slow your computer down to a crawl. Now generally with photo editing, when you make a mark, you can be reasonably confident whether it's a positive or a negative edit. So I don't think too high a number here is too critical. Around 20 is okay. That's okay for this particular screen. Color cursors, I've just left this as default, but you can change this however you want it. Transparency and gamut, again I've left this as default. The gamut, if you're not sure, is any colours which are outside of the reproducible palette of the printer. It's a warning that you can enable in Photoshop when you've done an edit, or you're doing a painting, or you're adjusting an image. You can turn on the gamut warning, apply a colour profile to the image and see which areas of the image can and cannot be reproduced within the colour space of the printer you're going to be using. So this is a very useful feature. Units and rulers. Units and rulers are something that I do use quite a lot, and being a photographic lab, we always work in inches because they are the photographic standards. The print resolution of new documents is always 300 dpi, and the screen resolution of 72 is kind of the standard for screen resolutions, regardless of whether it's a CRT monitor or something like this, which is an IPS monitor. Guides, grids and slices. I like to be able to see my guides, so I choose red for the colour of the guides. Smart guides I tend not to use, and because we're using inches it makes sense to subdivide every inch by 4. Plugins, the only thing I change here is show CS Live. I don't like that appearing in the top corner. And again, this is left to default. And finally 3D. This is using the computer's graphics card to do some of the calculations when using Photoshop. So if you have a graphics card which supports this feature, you can turn this up or down to use more or less of your available memory on the graphics card. Now again, I like to keep it reasonably high, but not high enough for it to interfere with displaying Windows or various other software that I have open. So those are the preferences. And if I press OK, what you do need to remember is to apply those preferences. We need to close and then reopen Photoshop.